joining forces to call for an end to the use of the phrase commit suicide in an attempt to try and help save lives. News 4's An Yang is here with more on suicide prevention efforts.
Here is a sobering statistic. Roughly 45,000 Americans each year die from suicide, and that is more than those killed annually in car accidents. Suicide is a leading cause of deaths in the U.S. and around the world. This week is National Suicide Prevention Week, and psychiatrist Dr. Joshua Weiner joins us today to talk more about this very sensitive topic and very timely. Thanks for being here. So these statistics are very troubling. Is suicide on the rise?
It is. So the CDC found that over the last 20 years, suicide rates have gone up almost 30%.
That's huge.
It's really huge. I mean, this is a massive problem. We talk about the opioid epidemic and all the people who are dying from that. That is way crushed by the number of people who are dying each day from suicide. It's like 50% more are dying from suicide than from opioids.
And what's causing this increase?
You know, we don't really know. So my guess, and this is just a guess, I don't really have data to back this up. I think that one thing we have to look at, particularly for younger people, because suicide rates are up for all ages and all demographics. For younger people in particular, I think social media is playing a role. If you're a vulnerable kid, you already are very sensitive about how you're doing socially. You're comparing yourself to others. You don't feel good about that. And then you go online and you look at people who are seemingly having a better life than you. That can push that vulnerable person over the edge.
Makes sense. And you say that if you talk about suicide, you have to talk about guns. Explain that.
Okay. 2/3 of all gun deaths in this country are suicide.
Wow.
People who have a gun in their house are 5 times more likely to die from suicide. Suicide for many can be an impulsive act. And when you use guns, your chances of dying are 95%. When you compare that to a more common type of suicide attempt, which is overdosing on pills, only about 2 to 3% of people will die when they do that. So guns are used in 5% of suicide attempts, but they account for over 50% of actual suicide deaths. So you really want to find out if somebody that you care about is going through a mental health crisis and they happen to have guns in their house. You want to say, hey, look, I'm really worried about you. Do you mind if we just give the guns to somebody else? Just get them out of the house for a little while until things are going better for you. It's not permanent, but we're worried. And because suicide sometimes can be something that you're not necessarily thinking about for a long time, it's like a vulnerable moment. I don't want to have a gun in the house where you can utilize it in those vulnerable states.
And so a couple of things. You talked about somebody in a mental health crisis. Do those people then are more likely to plan this out and think it through? And then if you do know somebody who is having suicidal thoughts, what should you do?
So, you know, a lot of people will have thoughts and plan it out in advance. So that there are definitely a large number of people who do that, and they'll talk about it, they'll make statements to people, maybe they'll give things away, etc. But my experience in 20 years of doing this is all my patients, for the most part, who have made suicide attempts, it's a very impulsive act. As an example, unfortunately, I just had a patient this weekend who jumped off the 11th story of his building. Thank God he hit something on the way down, shattered his body, but lived. And I talked to him about it the other day, and I said, what was going on? He said, well, I hadn't been thinking about suicide, but I was thinking about my ex who broke up with me. I had a couple drinks, and I thought about it for less than 5 minutes. He's jumping off his building. It is incredibly scary, which brings me to one other point I want to make. If somebody calls you and they're drunk or they're high and they're talking about suicide, you know, you might be on the receiving end of that, and you might think, you know what, they're just drunk or high. They're just talking nonsense. Let them sleep it off. No. That is when that person is much more vulnerable and likely because their inhibitions are down. So that is the time when you actually want to say, hey, I'm really worried about you. I'm coming over. So just something to think about.
Good point. Thanks so much, as always, Dr. Joshua Weiner, for that insight.
All right, good information. Thanks, guys.